My name is Arthur Vance. The day I inherited my late sister's barn, her husband, Mark, laughed right in my face. We were all sitting in a stuffy little lawyer's office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and cheap polish, when the final item of the will was read. The old family barn and the 2 acres it sat on were left to me. Mark, a man who always looked like he was smelling something bad, let out this short, sharp laugh. He turned to his kids, my niece and nephew, who were barely looking up from their phones, and he said, "What are you going to do with that pile of splinters, Arthur?" "Farm dust bunnies." He winked at them, and they smirked. That sound, that dismissive little scoff, felt sharper than a nail. In that moment, I wasn't just a brother-in-law. I was a fool, an old man clinging to garbage in their eyes. It was a brand of humiliation that sticks to you, heavy and cold. The lawyer, a young man who looked uncomfortable with the whole thing, just slid the old rusted key across the polished desk toward me. My hand felt heavy as I reached out to take it. I could feel Mark's stare, enjoying the show. He was a real estate developer, a man who saw land as numbers on a spreadsheet, not a place where memories were made. To him, the barn was a liability, an eyesore. He'd already mentioned that the county had condemned it years ago, that it was a quote-quote tetanus trap, and the land was worthless until someone paid to have it torn down. My niece and nephew didn't say a word, their silence a different kind of judgment. They were on their father's side, seeing me as this sentimental old relic, out of touch with the modern world, where everything has a price tag but nothing has any real worth. I just closed my fist around that key, the rust biting into my palm. I didn't say a word back to them. What was there to say? Arguing with a man like Mark is like trying to reason with a bulldozer. You just get run over. I gave a stiff nod to the lawyer, stood up, and walked out of that office. The worst part was hearing their soft laughter follow me down the hallway, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was worse. It was the kind of quiet, confident mockery that says, "We've already won." That sound was a world away from the laughter I remembered from my wife, Eleanor. Her laugh was like sunshine. This was like the scrape of metal on stone. As I walked down the steps and out into the street, I promised myself that their laughter wouldn't be the last word on the matter. That barn was more than just a pile of splinters to me. It was the last piece of my history I had left. The next day, I drove out to the property alone. The 2-acre lot was overgrown with weeds, and there it stood, just as they'd described it. The old barn was sagging in the middle, its spine broken. The roof was caved in on one side, letting the sky show through like a wound. The wind whistled through the gaps in the rotting planks, a mournful, lonely sound. It smelled of damp earth, decay, and 100 forgotten seasons. Mark was right, from a practical standpoint. It was a wreck. Anyone else would have seen a tear-down job, a bill to be paid. But as I stood there, I remembered bringing Eleanor to a town festival in that barn when we were young. I remembered carving our initials into one of the main support beams, right near the back wall. I could almost hear the music and the stomping feet, a ghost of a happier time. Now it was just me, the silence, and the enormous task ahead. I felt the weight of their judgments settling on my shoulders, heavier than the collapsed roof. They saw a fool. They saw an old man wasting his time and what little money he had on a ruin. And standing there, looking at the cracked foundation and the splintered wood, a sliver of doubt tried to creep into my own heart. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was just a sentimental fool's errand. What would you do if everyone you knew, even your own family, laughed at you for inheriting a ruin? Listen to my story until the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. My life wasn't built on grand plans or big city dreams. It was hammered together, board by board, right here in Oak Haven. I was born in a small house just a few miles from that barn, to a father who worked at the steel mill until it rusted shut and a mother who could make a garden grow on a patch of concrete. We didn't have much, but we had a code. You work hard, you tell the truth, and you don't owe anybody anything you can't pay back with your own two hands. I learned early that the world doesn't give you things. You earn them. You earn respect, you earn your keep, and you earn your peace. That was the foundation I was given, stronger than any concrete you could pour, and it's the one I've stood on my whole life, even when the ground shook. I fell in love with wood when I was just a boy. My father wasn't a carpenter, but he taught me how to hold a hammer, how to feel the grain of a plank and know which way it wanted to go. While other kids were playing ball, I was in our little shed, fixing chairs, building birdhouses, learning the language of sawdust and sweat. It wasn't a choice to become a carpenter. It was just who I was. For 40 years, I was the man people called when a floorboard creaked, when a roof leaked, or when they needed a cabinet built to last a lifetime. I never got rich, not by a long shot. But my name meant something in this town. It meant the job would be done right, and it meant my handshake was a contract. I met Eleanor at the Oak Haven Fall Festival. It was held in that very barn, back when the town still had enough life in it to hold festivals. The air was filled with the smell of hay and apple cider, and they'd strung up lights that made the whole place glow. She was wearing a blue dress, and her laugh cut through all the noise. We danced right there on that old wooden floor, the one that's now rotting away. I was a clumsy young man, all sharp elbows and nervous feet, but she didn't seem to mind. That night, under the watch of those heavy, hand-hewn beams, I felt like the luckiest man in the world. It was the beginning of everything that ever mattered to me. That barn became our place. A few weeks after we met, I took her back there on a quiet afternoon. The festival was long over, and the place was empty, filled with shafts of dusty sunlight. It was then that I took out my pocket knife and carved our initials inside a heart on one of the big support beams near the back. A+E. It was a silly, youthful thing to do, but it felt as permanent as a church vow. To me, that carving wasn't just a mark on a piece of wood. It was a promise. It was the start of a story that Mark, with all his money and his fancy suits, could never read or understand. He sees splinters. I see the first page of my life with her. We built our life like I built everything else, slowly, carefully, and with what we had. We bought a small house on the edge of town, one that needed a lot of work. I fixed the roof, I rebuilt the porch, I laid new floors in the kitchen. Eleanor made it a home. She planted roses along the fence and filled the rooms with warmth. We never had children. It was a quiet sorrow we carried together, but it made our bond stronger. Our life wasn't exciting by most people's standards. It was a simple routine of work, home, and Sunday dinners. But it was ours. It was a life of shared burdens and simple joys, a fortress we built against the world. Staying in Oak Haven was a choice. In my 30s, I got an offer to be a foreman for a big construction company down in the city. More money, a better future, everyone said. But my father's health was failing, and my mother couldn't manage him on her own. Eleanor and I talked it over one night on the porch swing. She looked at me and said, "Home is here, Arthur. Family is here." So I stayed. I turned down the job. I don't regret it. Some things are worth more than a bigger paycheck. Taking care of your own, seeing them through to the end, that's a kind of wealth Mark will never have. He measures a man's worth by his bank account. I measure it by his integrity. The hardest years of my life began the day the doctor told us about Eleanor's illness. It came on slow, then all at once. The vibrant woman who filled my life with laughter started to fade. My work changed. I stopped taking big jobs, then I stopped taking small ones. My workshop grew quiet. My hands, which had spent a lifetime building things for others, were now used to help her from her chair, to hold a spoon to her lips, to brush her hair. It was the most important work I've ever done. It was a heavy, heartbreaking kind of labor, but I would have carried that weight for 1,000 years, for one more day of her smile. One afternoon, near the end, we were sitting by the window, and she could see the top of the old Miller barn in the distance. It was already starting to sag back then. She was quiet for a long time, and then she squeezed my hand. "You know, Arthur," she whispered, her voice thin as a thread, "that old barn has good bones. One day, you should fix it up. Make it a place for your workshop, a place where you can build things again." It wasn't a command. It was a wish, a gentle nudge forward, for a time when I would be alone. That promise, whispered in a quiet room, became a cornerstone in my soul. It was the last project she ever gave me. After she was gone, the silence in our little house was deafening. For 5 years, it's just been me. The tools in my workshop gathered a thin layer of dust. The rhythm of my life was broken. I'd wake up, make coffee for one, and stare out the window. The world kept moving, but I felt like I was standing still. Oakhaven, a town already shrinking, felt even emptier without her. My work had always been my anchor, but without her to share the day's stories with, it felt hollow. I did small jobs, just enough to get by, but the passion was gone. I was just going through the motions, a man living in the shadow of his own past. My relationship with my sister's family was always polite, distant. My sister, God rest her soul, was a kind woman, but she was swept up in Mark's world. A world of country clubs and new cars and looking down on people like me. Mark always treated me with a kind of patronizing amusement. I was good old Arthur, the simple carpenter. He'd pat me on the back at family gatherings, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He saw my life of manual labor as a failure, a lack of ambition. His children, my niece and nephew, grew up breathing that same air. They learned from him that value is something you buy, not something you build. This town, Oakhaven, is a lot like me. It's got scars. The old mill stands like a tombstone at the edge of the river, a monument to a time that's gone. The storefronts on Main Street are a mix of struggling businesses and boarded-up windows. People here are survivors. They're proud, but they're tired. They've seen their children leave for better opportunities, and they've learned to make do with less. The decay of that old barn isn't unique. It's a reflection of everything around it. It's a symbol of a place and a way of life that the rest of the world has forgotten, deemed worthless, and left behind to rot. I remember the first time I ever fixed a roof all by myself. I was barely 20. It was for old Mrs. Gable, whose husband had just passed. A storm had torn a hole right over her kitchen. I spent 2 days up there under the hot sun, and when I was done, I felt 10 feet tall. She paid me with $20 and a fresh-baked apple pie. That pie tasted better than any fancy meal I've ever had. That's a small victory, I suppose. The kind that doesn't show up on a bank statement. I once built a cradle for my niece when she was born. A solid oak cradle, carved with little birds. Mark probably put it in the attic, preferring something store-bought and modern. But I built it. My hands made it. That's what matters. My whole life has been a testament to a simple belief. A man's character is in his work, not the title on his business card, but the sweat on his brow. It's in the straightness of the nail he drives, the sturdiness of the wall he builds. Mark sells land. He moves numbers around on a page and calls it creation. He doesn't understand the feeling of taking a rough piece of lumber and shaping it into something useful, something beautiful. He sees a pile of splinters because he has no concept of what it takes to turn splinters into a home. His world is disposable. Mine is built to last. I never knew much about my great-grandfather, the man who built that barn. The story passed down was that he was a poor farmer who lost everything. He was the family failure, the man whose name was spoken with a sigh. I used to think about him sometimes, wondering what he was like. I pictured him working this same land, struggling against the weather and the poor soil, and ultimately being beaten by it. In a strange way, I felt a connection to him. Another man from my bloodline who was measured and found wanting by the world. a man whose legacy was a story of defeat. Being underestimated is a quiet, steady weight. It's not a sudden blow, it's a slow erosion of how people see you. For years I've been just a carpenter, the simple, quiet man who was good with his hands but not much else. Mark's laughter in that lawyer's office wasn't new. It was just the loudest version of what I've felt from him for decades. People like him see a lack of greed as a lack of intelligence. They see contentment as a lack of drive. They look at a man who finds pride in a hard day's work and see a fool who doesn't know any better. They have been wrong about me my entire life. And so, all of that, the love for Eleanor, the promise I made her, the pride in my trade, a lifetime of being quietly dismissed, is what brought me back to this place. When I stand before this collapsing wreck, I'm not just seeing a building. I'm seeing the dance floor where I met my wife. I'm seeing the beam that holds our initials. I'm seeing a promise I have to keep. The mockery from Mark and his kids doesn't sting as much out here. It's just noise, carried away by the same wind that whistles through the broken planks. This isn't about proving them wrong. It's about proving my entire life, my entire way of being right. This is my history. And I will not let it be torn down. The first few days after that meeting in the lawyer's office were quiet, but it was a heavy, watchful kind of quiet. I went to the hardware store for some heavy-duty tarps and work gloves, a place where I've known the owner Bill for 30 years. He looked at me over the top of his glasses, his usual cheerful greeting replaced by a look of, well, it was pity. "Heard about the will, Arthur," he said, his voice a little too soft. "You got stuck with the old Miller barn, huh? That's a tough break." He didn't mean any harm by it, I know that. But the words, "stuck with," and "tough break," landed like little stones in my gut. It was the first sign that the story was already out, and the town had already passed its judgment. I wasn't a man who had inherited a piece of his family's past. I was a man burdened with a problem. The talk started to spread like moss on a damp wall, slow at first, then covering everything. At the Oakhaven Diner, where I've had the same breakfast every Tuesday for 2 decades, the conversations would dip to a whisper when I walked in. I'd sit in my usual booth, and I could feel the eyes on my back. Old acquaintances, men I'd shared a beer with after a long week's work, would give me a quick, tight-lipped nod instead of coming over to chat. They weren't being cruel, not directly. It was more like they didn't know what to say. How do you talk to a man who everyone thinks has lost his mind? They saw me as the subject of a sad story, the poor old widower who was now clinging to a pile of junk. The loneliness was thickest in that crowded room. It was my nephew, David, who called first. His voice had that smooth, practiced concern that people use when they think you're being difficult. "Uncle Arthur," he said, "Dad and I were talking. We're worried about you taking on that barn. It's a money pit. Dad feels bad about how things went down at the lawyer's office, and he wants to help you out. He'd be willing to take it off your hands for a small sum, just to cover your trouble." The offer was an insult wrapped in a fake apology. They weren't worried about me. They were worried I might somehow get in the way of whatever plans Mark had for the land. They still saw me as a simpleton who could be managed with a few condescending words and a pittance. I just told him, "I'm not interested, David," and the line went quiet for a moment before he sighed and hung up. Then came the nickname. I first heard it from a couple of teenagers hanging out by the post office. I was walking by, and one of them nudged the other and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "There goes the Splinter King." The other one snickered. Splinter King. It was meant to be a joke, a silly name for the old man with the rotting barn. But it cut deeper than they could ever know. My whole life, my hands had worked with wood. I'd built cradles and cabinets, fixed homes, brought comfort and sturdiness to people's lives. Now that same material, the very essence of my trade and my identity, was being used to mock me. I was no longer Arthur Vance, the carpenter. I was the king of a worthless, splintering kingdom. I just kept walking, my face burning. The isolation started to become more physical after that. I've lived on my street for over 40 years. I used to have a nodding acquaintance with everyone. We'd wave as we got the mail, or chat over the fence about the weather. But now, something had shifted. My neighbor to the east, a man I'd helped fix his fence just last summer, started to find his driveway fascinating whenever I was out in my yard. He'd stare at the pavement, pretending not to see me. People I'd known for years would cross the street if they saw me coming, suddenly remembering something urgent on the other side. It was a small thing, a tiny change in the daily choreography of the town, but it was a clear message. You are now different. You are separate. The invitations stopped coming. Not that I was ever the life of the party, but Eleanor and I used to get invited to the occasional neighborhood barbecue or holiday potluck. After she passed, the invitations had slowed, but they hadn't stopped completely. People would check in. Now there was nothing. A deafening social silence. I heard from a friend of a friend that my neighbor, 2 doors down, had a big 4th of July party. I sat on my porch that evening, smelling the charcoal, and hearing the distant pop of fireworks and the faint sounds of laughter. I wasn't just uninvited, I was forgotten. It felt like I had become invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a life I used to be a part of. Mark, my brother-in-law, didn't call me himself. He was too smart for that. He sent my niece, Sarah, to do his dirty work. She called one evening, her voice full of a syrupy pity that was almost worse than Mark's open contempt. "Uncle Arthur, we just think you're being sentimental," she said. "That barn is dangerous. What if you get hurt out there, all alone? Dad is willing to increase his offer. He'll even pay for the demolition himself. Think of it as a clean slate." A clean slate. She wanted me to erase the place where I met my wife, the place that held the last promise I made to her, for a few $1,000s. They didn't just think the barn was worthless. They thought my memories were, too. The work at the barn was a lonely battle. I spent the first week just clearing a path to the main door, fighting back years of weeds and tangled thorns. Every swing of the scythe felt like an act of defiance. But as I stood inside for the first time as its owner, the sheer scale of the decay was staggering. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rot. Pigeons had nested in the rafters, and their droppings covered everything in a white, chalky film. The collapsed section of the roof let in a pathetic slice of gray light, illuminating dancing dust motes. For a moment, standing there alone, surrounded by the evidence of time's victory, their laughter echoed in my head. A wave of doubt washed over me, cold and sharp. Maybe they were right. The locals who drove by on the old country road would slow down, their curiosity mixed with morbid fascination. I could see them pointing from their car windows, shaking their heads. One afternoon, a farmer I knew, Tom Peterson, pulled his truck over. He leaned out the window, a concerned frown on his weathered face. "Arthur," he called out, "what in God's name are you doing? This place is a teardown. I've got a nephew with a bulldozer who'd do it for a fair price. You're just throwing good money after bad." He meant to be helpful, to offer practical advice from one sensible man to another. But what I heard was another voice telling me I was a fool, that my project was a hopeless fantasy. I tried to focus on small victories. I managed to secure a large tarp over the hole in the roof, a temporary fix to keep the rain out. It was a brutal, physically demanding job for a man my age, wrestling with that heavy canvas in the wind. When I was finally done, I stood back, covered in dirt and sweat, my muscles screaming in protest. I felt a small flicker of pride. But then I looked at the barn as a whole, the sagging walls, the crooked frame, the one patched-up wound on a dying body. My small victory seemed pathetic, almost laughable. It was like putting a Band-Aid on a corpse. The weight of what was left to do, and the world's certainty that I would fail, pressed down on me. One day, I was trying to brace one of the main support beams, the one right next to the beam where I'd carved my initials with Eleanor. It was shifting, and the whole west wall groaned in protest with every gust of wind. It was a delicate, dangerous process. As I was working, Mark's car pulled up. He didn't get out. He just rolled down his window, his expensive suit looking ridiculous against the backdrop of decay. He watched me for a long minute, a little smirk playing on his lips. Then he just shook his head slowly, rolled up his window, and drove away. He didn't have to say a word. The look on his face said it all. Look at the old fool, playing with his pile of splinters. The humiliation was silent and complete. That evening I went through some of Eleanor's old things, looking for a photograph of us at that long-ago festival. I found it in a dusty album. We were so young. I was looking at her, and she was laughing, her head thrown back. In the background, you could just make out the strong, clean lines of the barn's interior, the warm glow of the festival lights. I held that picture in my calloused hands, and the contrast between that image and the reality I was facing every day was of physical pain. The world in that photograph was full of promise and strength. The world I lived in now was full of doubt and decay, not just in the barn's timbers, but in how everyone saw me. The financial pressure was a constant low hum of anxiety. I wasn't a rich man. My savings were meant for a quiet retirement, not for resurrecting a condemned building. Every purchase, every box of nails, every sheet of plywood, every new tool was a decision I had to weigh carefully. I started eating more simply, turning the heat down at night, cutting back on any small luxury. I knew my niece and nephew were picturing me draining my life savings into this worthless project. In their minds, it was the final proof of my incompetence, a sad old man squandering what little he had on a sentimental dream. Their judgment felt like an audit of my entire life. I started talking to myself out at the barn, not whole conversations, just little phrases muttered under my breath. "All right, Eleanor, let's see about this board," or "one more nail, just one more." It wasn't because I was going crazy, it was because the silence was too loud. The only other sounds were the wind and the creaking of the dying structure. In that vast, empty space, I was completely and utterly alone. The isolation wasn't just social anymore, it was a profound physical state. It was just me and the ghost of a promise against the judgment of the entire world. The breaking point, the moment I fully understood my new place in the world, came on a rainy Tuesday. I was at the diner, soaked to the bone from working at the barn. I sat in my booth, dripping onto the linoleum. A few tables over, a group of men I'd known my whole life were talking. One of them, a man I'd helped build a deck for, gestured with his coffee cup in my direction, not realizing I could hear him over the rain. "Poor Arthur," he said to his friends, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy. "It's a shame what happens when a man gets old and lonely. He just loses his grip. The Splinter King. Bless his heart." They all nodded in solemn agreement. Bless his heart. The three most damning words in the Southern vocabulary. It was the verbal pat on the head you give to a lost cause, to a fool you feel sorry for. It wasn't angry or malicious. It was worse. It was a final, pitying dismissal. In their eyes, I wasn't a man fighting for his history or honoring his wife. I was just a pathetic old man who had lost his way, a local charity case, a cautionary tale. I had become the old fool with the worthless property. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. I paid my bill without finishing my meal and walked out into the rain. I didn't go home. I drove straight back to the barn. I stood in the doorway, the rain dripping from the tarp I'd so proudly put up, and looked into the cavernous darkness. I saw a reflection of myself in a shard of broken glass on the floor, a blurry, rain-streaked figure. And in that moment, I saw what they all saw. A tired, old man, alone, covered in dirt, standing in a ruin. Their whispers and their pity had finally found a crack in my resolve and seeped in. But as I stood there, letting their judgment wash over me, something else stirred. It was a stubborn, familiar feeling. It was the same feeling I had when a piece of wood fought me, when a joint wouldn't fit, when a project seemed too complex. It was a quiet, cold anger, not at them, but at the idea of quitting. Let them whisper. Let them call me the Splinter King. Let them think I was a fool. They saw a ruin, but I knew what Eleanor had seen. She had seen good bones. And I, Arthur Vance, the carpenter, knew better than anyone that you never, ever give up on a structure with good bones. The rain kept falling, but inside me a fire had just been lit. The rain had stopped, but the air in the barn was still heavy and cold. I was working in the back, in the area that used to be the livestock stalls. The floor there was in the worst shape, a patchwork of rot and solid oak that had somehow endured. I was trying to clear away the debris to get a look at the foundation beam beneath when it happened. I jammed my crowbar into a section of flooring to pry it up, and it didn't just splinter. It punched through with a hollow, resonant thump that was all wrong. It wasn't the sound of breaking wood hitting damp earth. It was the sound of a tool hitting a void, a hidden space. My heart, which had been beating in a slow, tired rhythm, gave a single, hard kick against my ribs. I stopped, my breath held tight in my chest. I tapped the area again with the head of the crowbar. Thump, thump, thump. It was unmistakable. There was a cavity beneath these boards. For a moment, every doubt, every whisper of Splinter King came rushing back. I thought, maybe it's just a sinkhole, a collapsed cistern, another problem, another bill, another reason for them to be right about me. But my hands, which have known wood my entire life, felt a different story. The boards here were cut differently, fitted together with a precision that was out of place in a simple livestock stall. This wasn't an accident of decay. This was deliberate. This was built with a new kind of energy, a nervous, focused strength. I started carefully prying up the planks one by one. Beneath the rotted top layer was a second floor, a false floor, made of thick, well-preserved oak planks. They were heavy, and lifting them took all the strength I had. Underneath them was not dirt, but a thick layer of old, dry sawdust, packed tight like insulation. And nestled in that sawdust, wrapped in thick black oilcloth that was still slick to the touch, were several objects. The air that rose from the space was dry and ancient. It smelled of old leather, cold iron, and time itself. I knelt there on the damp ground, my hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming feeling that I was on the brink of something that would change everything. The barn was quiet around me, but in my head a storm was brewing. My hands first found the books. They were heavy, leather-bound ledgers, 3 of them, the kind you only see in museums now. The leather was stiff but not cracked, and the brass clasps were tarnished but strong. I ran my thumb over the embossed cover of the first one. There were no words, just a simple design of a hammer and an anvil. I opened it. The pages were filled with a neat, disciplined cursive, recording dates, names, orders, and sums of money. It was an account book, meticulously kept. I didn't understand what I was looking at yet, but I knew, with the certainty of a man who values good work, that this was the record of a serious business. This was not the idle scribbling of a failed farmer. Next to the ledgers, I felt the cold, heavy shapes of iron. I carefully brushed away the sawdust and unwrapped another layer of oilcloth. What I found took my breath away. It was a set of cast-iron cookware, a deep skillet, a Dutch oven, several smaller pans. But this wasn't like any cast iron I'd ever seen. It was flawless. The surfaces were smooth as polished stone, without a single pit or blemish. They were heavy, perfectly balanced, and on the bottom of each piece was that same small stamped emblem of a hammer and an anvil. This wasn't mass-produced hardware. This was the work of a master, preserved as if it had been made yesterday. It was a treasure of craftsmanship, a language my hands understood better than words. Finally, my fingers brushed against a cold, hard rectangle. It was a tin box, the kind people use to keep important papers in. It was rusted at the edges, but the lid was still snug. I had to use the tip of my crowbar to pry it open. It popped with a sigh of air that had been trapped for a God knows how long. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and underneath them, a single, folded document. It was a deed. My hands shook as I unfolded it. It was dated 1888, and it was the original deed to this property, signed and authenticated, granting my great-grandfather, Thomas Vance, sole and undisputed ownership of these 2 acres, and a line of legal script nearly made my eyes blur, all mineral and timber rights appertaining thereto. I sat back on my heels, the deed in one hand, the cold tin box in the other. Mineral rights. Mark, with all his developer's cunning, had checked the county records, the modern records. But this was the original document, from a time when such things were filed and sometimes forgotten. He had assumed the land was worthless because the modern files showed nothing of value. He never would have thought to look for a secret hidden for over a century. That deed alone, proving ownership of rights no one knew existed, transformed this worthless plot of land into a strategic asset of unknowable value. Mark had laughed at me for inheriting a pile of splinters, but I was holding the one piece of paper that made his assessment a joke. I untied the ribbon and began to read the letters. The handwriting was the same as in the ledgers. It was my great-grandfather's hand, writing to his brother. He wrote about the farm, about the poor soil, about the struggle to make ends meet. This was the story the family knew. But then, the letters took a turn. He wrote of a discovery, a seam of rich ore, he found by the creek bed at the back of the property. A small, but exceptionally high-quality deposit of iron ore. He knew that if the local mining companies found out, they would use every legal trick in the book to take his land. He was a farmer, not a tycoon. He couldn't fight them. So he decided on a different path. He didn't become a miner, he became an artist. My great-grandfather, the man my family remembered as a failure who lost the farm, had built a small, clandestine foundry right here in this barn. He taught himself the craft, melting down his own ore and creating custom-ordered cast-iron pieces. The ledgers weren't farm accounts. They were the records of his secret business. He made cookware, tools, and decorative ironwork for wealthy industrialists, railroad barons, and architects who wanted quality and discretion. He built a reputation through quiet word of mouth, a ghost in the world of industry. His work prized for its unparalleled quality. He wasn't a failure. He was a brilliant, secretive entrepreneur. The letters explained his caution. He lived in a time of grifters and swindlers. A poor farmer who suddenly came into wealth would have been a target. He feared for his family's safety, for the jealousy and trouble it would bring to a small, tight-knit community. So he hid his success. He lived simply, played the part of a struggling farmer, and literally buried the evidence of his true work right under his feet. He was building a fortune not for himself, but for the future, for his son. He was protecting his legacy from a world he didn't trust. It wasn't an act of shame, it was an act of profound, calculated love. The last letter was the hardest to read. It was dated 1918. He wrote that his son, my grandfather's brother, was due home from the war in France soon. He planned to finally reveal the secret to him, to pass on the business and the wealth he had so carefully accumulated. It was a letter full of hope and plans for the future. But my great-uncle never came home. He was killed in the last weeks of the war. And with that loss, it seems my great-grandfather's spirit broke. The secret, meant for a son who would never hear it, was buried for good. The family story of failure wasn't a lie, but it was a profound misunderstanding. He hadn't lost the farm to poverty. He had lost his reason to continue his secret work. I sat there in the silence of the barn, the whole history of my family rearranging itself in my mind. I looked at the ledgers again. The sums were small at first, then grew steadily. I'm no accountant, but I can do basic math. I pulled out a pencil and a scrap of paper from my pocket and started doing some rough calculations, trying to adjust for over a century of inflation. The numbers were staggering. It wasn't millions upon millions, not the kind of fortune that makes headlines. But it was substantial. It was more than enough to live on for the rest of my life in comfort. It was enough to restore this barn 10 times over. It was enough to change the fate of a small, dying town like Oakhaven. Slowly, Methodically, I began to put everything back. I wrapped the cookware in its oilcloth, placed the letters and the deed back in the tin box, and closed the heavy ledgers. I nestled them all back into their sawdust bed, just as they had been. This wasn't a treasure to be dug up and spent. It wasn't a winning lottery ticket. It was a story. It was a legacy of quiet strength, of hidden genius, of a man who fought the world on his own terms and won, even if no one ever knew it. In that moment, I felt a connection to him so strong it was like he was standing there with me. I was his blood, and I understood his silence. I thought of Mark, laughing in that lawyer's office. I thought of my niece and nephew, and their pitying phone calls. I thought of the whispers in the diner, the nickname Splinter King. Their judgment had been based on a world of surfaces, of what could be seen and appraised in a single glance. They looked at a collapsing barn and saw a liability. They looked at an old man in work clothes and saw a fool. They had no capacity to imagine that the real value of things and of people is almost always hidden from view. They were blind, and they were laughing at their own blindness. A deep, unshakable calm settled over me. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid certainty. I knew what I had to do. I would not tell them. I would never speak a word of this to Mark or his children. What would be the point? They wouldn't understand the honor of it. They would only see the money, and they would fight over it like dogs over a scrap of meat. My great-grandfather had protected his legacy from the grifters of his time. It was now my duty to protect it from the grifters of mine. My justice would not be a confrontation. It would be a continuation of his work. It would be silent, and it would be built with my own 2 hands. I placed the false floorboards back, one by one, covering the secret of my great-grandfather's life. I didn't feel a rush of excitement or a thirst for revenge. What I felt was a deep, profound sense of responsibility. To reveal this discovery to Mark and his children would be like throwing a masterpiece into a pig pen. They would only see the dollar signs. They would trample the story, the honor, the quiet genius of the man who built this place. They would fight over the money, and in doing so they would destroy the one thing that was truly priceless, the legacy of silent strength. My justice would not be loud. It would be built, just like everything else in my life, with my own hands, board by board. My plan was simple. I would honor the silence, I would honor the work, and I would honor the promise I made to Eleanor. With a spirit I hadn't felt in years, I threw myself into the restoration. But this was different from the desperate patching I'd done before. This wasn't a fight against decay. It was a partnership with the barn's good bones. I used my savings, the money I'd carefully put away for a quiet retirement. But it didn't feel like an expense. It felt like an investment in my own soul. I replaced every rotten plank, milled new beams to match the old, and rebuilt the collapsed section of the roof, letting sunlight pour into the vast space. I worked from dawn until dusk, the familiar ache in my muscles a welcome friend. The smell of fresh-cut pine and cedar replaced the scent of mold and rot. I wasn't just fixing a building. I was building my sanctuary. I was building the workshop Eleanor had dreamed of for me. Once the barn was structurally sound, a magnificent and sturdy cathedral of wood, I took the next step. I contacted a lawyer in a city 3 states away, a man I'd never met. Following my precise, anonymous instructions, he used a portion of the funds from my great-grandfather's carefully recorded accounts to establish the Oak Haven Heritage Fund. It was a sizable donation, enough to save the old town hall from demolition and restore the facade of the library. No one in town knew where the money came from. They called it a miracle, a gift from a mysterious benefactor. I'd listen to the talk at the diner, the sense of hope returning to people's voices, and I'd just sip my coffee. My great-grandfather had used his secret wealth to protect his family. I was using it to protect our town. It wasn't long before Mark drove by. He stopped his car in the middle of the road, his jaw practically on the steering wheel. The pile of splinters was gone. replaced by a structure that was both a piece of history and a work of art. He called me that evening, his voice a strained mix of disbelief and greed. He tripled his last offer. I listened patiently before I gave him my answer, the same answer I would give him every time he called in the desperate months and years that followed. "I appreciate the offer, Mark," I said, my voice calm and steady. "But the place has more value to me than money." The silence on the other end of the line was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. It was the sound of a man trapped in a prison of his own making, forever wondering what he had been too blind to see. Now, I spend my days in my workshop. The light streams through the high windows, illuminating the fine dust from the lathe. The cast-iron skillet my great-grandfather made sits on a small stove in the corner, and I use it to cook my lunch every day. It holds the heat better than anything made in the last 100 years. My family leaves me alone. They don't know what to think, and their uncertainty is a far more fitting consequence than any argument I could have won. They see a beautifully restored barn, and they are tormented by the value they can't calculate. They see an old carpenter, content in his work, and they can't understand his peace. They called me the Splinter King. They were right, in a way. I am the king of a kingdom built from what they threw away, and its riches are something their money can never buy.